Nice to meet you guys. My name's Joe. I'm a doctor and a data scientist in the NHS, and I'm a healthcare AI academic at Imperial College. For the past couple of years, myself and the team have been prototyping and implementing a population health AI platform in London, based in northeast London, and I'd love to share a bit about what we've been doing with you today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the barriers that we face in the NHS when it comes to implementing and scaling AI. Then I'm going to show you a bit about the platform that we've built and a little bit of the work that we've been doing on it over the past year or so. And then just one slide on the next year or two and what that looks like for us in terms of our efforts to scale up our work across the region. But first, everything starts with data. In the last year, there were 90,000 electronic data flows across NHS England. These originated from 7,000 healthcare providers, flowing up to hundreds of entities who are extracting, maintaining, and using patient data. And this is obviously a vast and absolutely incredible ecosystem. And it's really a testament to the advances in digital maturity that have been achieved in the NHS over the past 10 years. And really, this would be unimaginable 20 years ago. And if you combine this with the advances in clinical AI algorithmic research, then it may seem that we have never really been closer to this vision of personalized healthcare that we have also been dreaming about for at least a decade. And what does this look like? Well, what this means is instead of describing the prevalence of chronic disease within a population, we can start to predict disease for individuals. And what this means is for any individual at any given point in time, we can identify what the optimum therapy and optimum intervention for that patient might be. And in a healthcare system which seems to be permanently resource limited, we can start to anticipate, forecast, and plan for service demand. And we can start to plan for trajectories of patient multimorbidity so we can target preventative healthcare with greater precision. The truth is, we're not actually that close. And really the reason is that the NHS, as some of you may already know, is incredibly fragmented. So if you look at the data flows which appear rich, and indeed they are very rich at the point of data generation, the actual flows moving up tend to be very curated, data-minimized data sets for single purposes that don't accurately and completely capture populations or the information within populations. If you're trying to do something as big as population health AI and scaling that within the NHS, you're dealing with literally thousands of different organizations with their own data control and their own competing but also perfectly valid interests, which means it's very difficult to get any sort of united infrastructure or any sort of end-to-end processes in place. A typical data pipeline in the NHS might look like someone manually abstracting data from an electronic health record onto an Excel spreadsheet, then emailing that off to someone to generate some sort of insight, which means there's no inbuilt production capability, which also means that any time we deploy a predictive intervention, it's likely to be fire or forget. There's no such thing as MLOps, and there's no post-deployment lifecycle where we can start to look at responsibility or fairness or safety. And finally, and I'm probably as culpable of this as are many of my colleagues, a lot of the clinical AI work done in the NHS is focused in academia, where we're developing models for academic interest to get the next round of funding by producing more papers. And that's a far distance away from where the action actually happens on the sharp end of the stick at the front lines of clinical care. And all this means is that the hype that you see in media about healthcare AI doesn't really translate. So there's many amazing teams around the country in the NHS dealing with this, and there's many ways to deal with this. A lot of the best work is done in radiomics with computer vision for very well-defined pathways. We're interested in electronic health data and population health use cases, which is potentially a little bit more complex. And we've taken an approach which may seem quite simple to those in the room. We've taken a leaf out of non-healthcare industries and this sort of enterprise approach to data and AI with vertical integration, which really means taking all the components of this AI lifecycle and trying to bring them under one roof or umbrella and bring them closer together. So that's everything from defining need and developing the products, to the data, to the model development, to the deployment, to that post-deployment and production lifecycle to measuring impact on the other end. And we chose to work in Northeast London for a few good reasons. Chief among them, they have very high data maturity compared to other regions in London. They've got a very strong and innovative leadership. And they also have a very strong data engineering department. And they'd recently developed a new infrastructure built in Snowflake where they can ingest linked low latency data from 2 million patients across their care region, from primary care and secondary care, and maintain it on this data platform. We brought the clinical AI and the clinical AI researchers into the ICB region, and we had a local instance of Dataiku that could read the raw data that was being ingested into Snowflake, and we would use it for data wrangling, for prototyping, for model development, but also very importantly for us, we used it as a deployment platform where we found we had easy to use ways of deploying MLOps and a whole production infrastructure around the models. Perhaps most importantly, ICBs, or commissioning bodies in the NHS, are the payers. So they're the commissioners. They're the ones who commission and pay for clinical services. And these include population health pathways and integrated care pathways. And that puts everything that we're doing in close proximity to the intervention arm. So that's identifying need or proactively anticipating need and feeding predictions back to those who need it. And this whole setup was also conformant to the NHS England secure data environment compliance features. So this is some of the work that we did in the platform. The first thing we looked at was forecasting, which is probably bread and butter to a lot of people in non-healthcare industries. Actually, it's been around for a long time in the NHS as well, for 20 years. But traditionally, it's always been seasonal. So you use what happened in the previous year to try and predict what happens in the next year. And traditionally, it's based on predictable recurrent seasonal patterns, often driven by flu. And what we're really interested in is this pandemic is this transmission of respiratory disease, because that's what causes winter pressures, which adds to emergency demand and elective cancellations, which is what costs the NHS money. This all went out of the window after COVID, because suddenly you had multiple viruses in the community with competing transmissions and your epidemiological patterns all changed. And suddenly you had many peaks and troughs up and down throughout the year that became very, very difficult to predict. So we were able to tackle this because we had linked and low latency data flows coming onto a platform where we could employ and deploy deep learning. So we use multivariate forecasting using transformer models. We use primary care data, including daily encounter data, what happened, when it happened, symptoms, disorders, diseases for patients stratified by how vulnerable they were to hospital admission, along with some environmental variables. And using those, we could predict what would happen in hospitals 2 weeks from now and even a month from now, and what would go through the front door. This is about cardiovascular risk prediction, and by that I mean predicting who is going to get a heart attack, a stroke, or renal failure over the next 3 years. And this particular model shown here performs with better precision than the standard NHS models for cardiovascular risk. And we train this using AutoML. And this is very much data-centric because it's enabled by the data engineering and the high quality and the vast amount of data that we have for these patients. We deployed this with a functional, but rudimentary, but functional MLOps stage, where we were able to monitor the data quality, the coding patterns, and the distribution of the data coming in for drift. And we were also able to monitor predictive performance, not just in the population, but in subgroups of the population. And we could validate this across the geography in different locations. This was all put into one Dataiku environment in production. And the outputs we could use to predict risk at a practice level, but also at an individual level, where because we have access to the health record, we can identify methods for treatment optimization. So patients who could have their medications modified or medications added to try and reduce their risk of the impending cardiovascular event, whatever that is. And finally, this is about population healthcare. This is about anticipating trajectories of multimorbidity in the population. The scatter plot that you see over there represents 20,000 different disease concepts mapped from the recorded lifetime of 2 million patients in the region. And what this is doing is using machine learning to divide these into groups of concepts with similar meaning, and also subdivide them into groups of diseases that indicate different patterns of progression, but also different possible outcomes over time. And because this contains longitudinal information, we can look into these groups and look at how patient groups have trajectory of disease and multimorbidity, and divide these over key demographic groups. So, for example, with ethnicity, but also across deprivation. And there's the potential to use this data then to model the onset of multimorbidity within not just the population, but regions and also key population subgroups that we can then target with preventative healthcare interventions. And this is an example of what happens when you can take very good data and good infrastructure and bring the type of work that's usually found within clinical AI research in close proximity to centers of population health and potential interventions. There's one other very good reason that we built in Northeast London. And if you zoom out a little bit, you'll see that Northeast London hosts what we call the London Health Data Service, or the London Data Service. The London Data Service will come into operation at the end of this year or early next year. And what it does is it ingests data from almost 2,000 care providers across the city for a population of 10 million patients, linked with low latency and supported by a wide network of data governance agreements with care providers, but also with widespread public outreach and public assent through programs run by One London. And this has been developed and supported by a huge team and a very wide range of stakeholders around the city. And the idea of this is to have one central, very strong data layer that will provide data as a service, not just to the 5 ICBs across London, but also to the subnational secure data environment, which will be one of the main nodes in the country for clinical and life sciences research going forwards. What this means is that the vertical infrastructure and the vertical system we've built in Northeast London can be expanded horizontally, potentially in the future, across multiple systems without needing to port it or to upgrade anything or the need to reform or change anything. And this is what things are going to look like in the near future. So the next year or two, there's going to be minimal model development, and there's going to be almost no model deployment, because we want what we've done to be safe, to be secure, and be sustainable for the future. So the first thing that means for us is device regulation. Everything we produce, it should be, and it will be regulated as software as medical device. But obviously, having to take every single predictive model and pass it through medical regulation is a limitation, and we will be working with regulators to make sure that we can still produce models responsibly to population need. We also believe that responsibility goes far beyond regulation. So what that means is embedding ethical AI and fairness concepts directly into processes that we can deploy on the ground. And practically what that looks like is MLOps. It's a strong production lifecycle where we're able to monitor models, we can monitor their safety, we can monitor the impacts, and we can monitor their fairness and respond to them in an effective fashion. What that means is having a central team of experts, including data scientists and ML engineers, not only to develop models in response to whatever the needs of the ICBs and the populations are, but also to deploy them and to maintain them in an ongoing fashion. And one advantage of that is by pulling in experts from recognized academic centers of expertise across the city, we can pool that and share that expertise across the very diverse population in a city, often who don't fall into the catchment areas of these big academic centers. And in the longer term, what we can see then is that the NHS can potentially build up a library of these models which are trained by the NHS, developed for the NHS on NHS data for NHS patients, that we can first horizontally expand across the region, but then also take to other regions, potentially in different locations, adapt them for that population and deploy them there. And this follows a model of not just external validation, but repeated local revalidation for local use cases. And as this continues to proceed, we'll continue to generate evidence for the use of AI in population health. So a promising road, but a long way to go. So this was all led by our two directors, Graham Crawford, who's director at the ICB of Data Analytics, and Professor James Tail for Data and AI, who can't be here today, sadly. But hope you found that interesting and very happy to discuss.